Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast with myself, Fergus Crawley.
And myself, Jonny Payne.
And...
James Blanchard.
No, you didn't say myself.
Yeah, you
ruined
Oh,
that,
sorry. I'm not familiar with all these rules. Sorry, everyone.
James, we're just very off the cuff and hilarious. We didn't plan that at all, and you just missed out. So familiarity is not the problem. The problem is that people listening thus far have not yet followed or subscribed the podcast, and we would like you to do that at this point. If you have not yet done so, please make sure to rate the show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I don't even know if you can rate on other platforms, to be honest. And that's pretty much it. Share this with a friend if there's any value. There is going to be value, because today we believe we're going to talk about one of the most hotly debated and most accessible components of hybrid training, the discussion around it, and that is bodybuilding / hypertrophy training alongside running. Most popularized form of hybrid training online, most accessible in terms of kit, climate, gym access, specialist equipment, etc., etc.
People want to be jacked. People
Yeah.
want to run.
Yeah, that's pretty much it, isn't it?
Yeah. Accessible is probably the right word, I would think. Yeah.
So to start the conversation, I know you guys have spoken last week about how things have progressed from James's background and how we've got to the point that we have now. But James, do you want to start off by giving us a bit of context on your bodybuilding / hypertrophy focus background and what you felt you were lacking that has now been developed as a result of changing your training focus?
Sure. So, as we briefly touched upon in the last episode, we talked about my kind of power sports background. So, a lot of powerlifting, sprinting, very much towards that kind of like fast twitch side of the spectrum. I always loved getting in the gym. So it felt like once my kind of athletic career, if we can call it that, came to an end, I decided, actually, do you know what? I quite like doing stuff in the gym. Let's do a bit of a bodybuilding focus phase. So I got prepped for a few photo shoots, made hypertrophy very much like the cornerstone of my programming. And then, as you alluded to, where I kind of eventually felt like things were lacking, especially after going through quite a few, should we call them like bulking and cutting cycles, especially towards the end of a bulk, I was basically just not doing any cardio. So where I might have played rugby in the past or done some track work, that side of things was nicely covered, but just wasn't doing much aerobic work. So there's a massive hole there. And it would even get to the point of, say, I'm not a particularly tall guy. So if I get up into the high 80 kilo kind of mark, I would really notice a difference, kind of even going upstairs and stuff like that. And I think you get to the point where you just think, actually, do you know what? This is pretty stupid. You might be feeling pretty jacked, strong, but if you haven't got those kind of base levels of fitness, they're like, what are you doing with your life? What are you doing kind of for your longevity, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you can feel jacked and look jacked, and often it's going to be your own subjective viewpoint, isn't it? Look in the mirror and get that feedback that way. But then when you, as you say, you climb the stairs or you try to jog for a catch up with somebody who's 2 yards ahead, and you think, oh my God, this being jacked is not all. This is, like you said, there's something missing. Did you feel that at the time, or is that something that you later came to upon kind of opening yourself up to this kind of world of hybrid training? Is that, or did you think at the time, you know what, this is not right?
I mean, it's all relative, right? Like, I'm probably, almost definitely fitter now than I ever have been, but difficult to compare that to kind of how I would have felt back at the time. But I mean, we touched upon it in our last pod, Jonny, where we spoke about in the first lockdown, someone nominated me to do a 5K, that charity thing. Yeah. And it absolutely battered me. And I think that was one of the biggest wake up calls I've had. And that was the kind of the catalyst to get me to get in touch with yourself and get some coaching. Just because that was, as I say, that was one side of things I just wasn't covering.
We've had a few echoes of that, haven't we? I think Alex at one point talked about the same thing, thinking, yeah, 5K. I mean, we talked about it last time. 5K will be all right. That's easily within my wheelhouse. And after 2 and a bit K, you're like, this is not in my wheelhouse. I am not in my wheelhouse.
It's that ego protection thing, right? You think like, 5K is nothing. It's fine. But actually,
exactly that. Yeah.
Can put you in the bin.
If you go too hard, too fast as well, you can, after 1K, you can be really in trouble.
Especially somebody like James, who's got that kind of capability of high, fast bursts of speed, but then you kind of get found out, don't you, when you realize that kind of aerobic capacity doesn't allow you to follow that up with any, over that kind of distance. So,
well, lads, if you sprint a marathon, you're going to win. So we'll all try it at some point, won't we? But I think let's rewind for a bit of context before we make it a bit more accessible and generalized, because what I'm interested in from a selfish point of view is how you felt when you were really in the depths of prep.
Yeah.
That sort of real tail 4 to 6 weeks where things are pretty brutal, and how that compared to the other end of the spectrum where you were sort of peak chonk at the higher end of the 80. I was hoping we'd all straight face that back. Peak chonk,
Peak
what a
chonk.
phrase. Anyway, enough about
it's all gone peak chonk. That's the new thing. All right, crack on.
Oh dear. Yes, so peak chonk versus minor chonk is top end of 80s. What did you bottom out at bodyweight wise?
72.9, I think it was at my leanest.
So 70. So there's essentially a 10 kilo variance. Well, no, sorry, closer to 15, 17, something like that kilo variance, I'd imagine. But essentially, there were diminishing returns at the top end and diminishing returns at the bottom end. Just to set the scene of those that maybe come from a physique background or a really getting lean background, I know personally when I get really lean, I can't maintain it from a performance point of view because I feel terrible. So maybe for 4 to 6 weeks I can do it. I do feel like my performance and recovery starts to take a big hit, which is why I've never really committed to getting mad jacked and staying mad jacked. I sit at a reasonable body shape most of the year, but it's always performance focused. So anything aesthetic is really a byproduct. There's never a I would like to look X or Y in the mirror goal for me. And that's something that actually I did away with when I was younger, because I did used to focus on that and realize when I was lean, I felt terrible. So from your perspective, having done it more diligently, what were the really demanding elements of being super lean and holding on to it for the photo shoots and things you've done in the past where you were like thick skin, jacked?
So, I mean, you've got a caveat, right? From some people are going to be able to handle it better than others. And, you know, we've all got those people that kind of somehow inexplicably manage to stay absolutely shredded year round and be absolutely fine. But from a personal point of view, much like yourself. But yeah, no, for myself, to be honest, the main issue for me was a mood disturbance kind of thing. And that's not even just kind of from the point of view of like, oh, you get all stroppy. It's more like your motivation to train goes down the toilet. Even it can get to that point, or it might be like the fatigue. So generally speaking, if you've not got much food coming in and you're in that real low state of energy availability, you're not going to be able to perform, right? And so recovery, from a recovery point of view, that absolutely sucks. Ability to actually fuel your training sessions is incredibly hampered as well, because you're constantly thinking about your diet, trying to drive a calorie deficit, or depending on what kind of phase of dieting you're in, it might be you're just trying to maintain a low body weight. That's going to make a massive difference as well. You're not gearing your fueling towards actually fueling your training. It's more towards a body composition point of view. So if you are doing these really taxing energy systems training sessions or cardio training sessions, whatever you want to call it, you're going to be on the back foot somewhat by default. And I think that's probably the biggest issue. And something that if someone does want to have these kind of dual goals between body comp and training like a hybrid athlete, that's something that needs to be kind of very, very much finely tuned.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting as well, because I think we start off on let's highlight the peak ends of the spectrum, but I think for the majority of people listening, and where we would probably recommend people with these goals sit is in the middle somewhere, which is if you have a hypertrophy focused set of goals, i.e. you're training in a certain rep range, your volume is X, Y, Z, and you just want to get a bit bigger, a bit more jacked, whilst building your aerobic capacity, running capacity, improving your 5K time, running your first marathon, whatever it might be, there are lots of things to consider. So I think it's important that we've highlighted both ends of the spectrum, whereby the traditional bulking cutting cycle, if you're trying to get on stage or prepare for a photo shoot and get really, really shredded, that's probably a more nuanced conversation that we won't touch on in detail today, because the individuality of when somebody gets under 8% body fat or when somebody is really top end bulking side of things, because there's obviously different appetites and other things to bear in mind, ultimately is out with our wheelhouse of expertise from a real specific, having lived through it point of view, because I've never committed to a huge bulking cycle, other than, to be fair, the first 16 years of my life I just ate everything in sight. But the middle ground, Jonny, main considerations for somebody that would come to us saying, I would like to get a bit bigger, a bit stronger, ultimately a bit more jacked. whilst also preparing for my first half marathon?
If the first thing that springs to mind for me, with bodybuilding and running being the main drivers here, I think bodybuilding, correct me if I'm wrong, James, from your perspective as a coach and as an athlete, I actually think that that's quite possibly one of the hardest to manage.
I agree.
Because there is a lot of volume to be considered. There are various different splits and body parts and this thing and that thing, and obviously, if bodybuilding itself is the goal, then we're not just looking at being kind of just bigger. We're looking at a sort of a very specific approach to it. And then there's the wear and tear because of the nature of the rep schemes and all the rest of it, and the load. There's the wear and tear on the tendons, etc., which, depending on which side of a deficit or surplus you're on, can become quite wearing quite quickly. So I think that the main consideration, or the first consideration we have to look at, is volume, overall volume, especially on the resistance training side of things. Obviously, as a whole, as a program, but I think that's probably where we need to kind of focus our attention. And then talking with the athlete, having the athlete understand that we will be doing certain things with the running. There will be certain things that the running can contribute. There'll be certain things we have to consider as being perhaps deleterious that the running might be doing, that we have to then factor into the entire volume. So if somebody's coming to us with a background of bodybuilding, we will have to recognize that we still have to bodybuild, but it won't be quite in the same manner as if they were doing a traditional bodybuilding program. And I think you and I, as coach athlete in that sense, kind of went through that quite easily, because you have a very considered approach and you kind of understood it. But there's still, again, correct me if I'm wrong, there's still elements of that where you're probably looking at it thinking, oh, but I haven't got my X or I haven't got my Y in here. Is this going to be enough for me? And you kind of had to go through the journey, I think, didn't you?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, yeah, I never would have believed you from the start having such like a low training volume. I think at some points we were probably even training each muscle group maybe once per week.
Yeah.
Had the volume per body part like average of like maybe 8 sets per body part, which is by most people's standards is pretty low, right? But it was what needed to be done, especially in those early stages, before we kind of ramp things up a little bit higher. And I guess, like, tell me if you agree or disagree, but it's that whole perspective of having that minimum effective dose in place first.
Yeah.
And I think steadily ramping our way up rather than, trying to take a bodybuilding program as is, adding some other shit to it and hope that it works.
Yeah, exactly that, mate. I think that minimum dose and then working from there makes sense across the board, doesn't it? With any pursuit, in my mind. But I think bodybuilding is where it's the most easy to highlight and the most easy to get wrong. The most easy, is that bad English?
Easiest.
It's the easiest, yeah.
You could have probably just...
I could have just gotten away with that.
Yeah, you shot yourself in the foot there, but continue.
But I think you're right. Yeah. Once a week on each body part, which, I mean, that's not something that's unusual. It's just a different approach maybe to the one that you'd had. That's certainly bodybuilding. Some people favor that kind of split. I think that's useful from a hybrid perspective because it allows us to play with recovery a little bit better, which is exactly where I was approaching it from your perspective, is that, we do legs on one particular day and we played with the intensity and volume load as we like to do, but it also allowed us the opportunity to then have that body part recover before we had to go again, because ultimately we're doing a lot of resistance training.
It's worth being completely honest here, because I don't want there to be any misconceptions from our point of view and a sales or marketing point of view that the background of the athlete is imperative when making these considerations, because James came from a background of having a lot of muscle mass, and the research on the amount of volume required to maintain the muscle mass that is already there versus the amount required to build more, the disparity is enormous. So the big psychological thing that needs to happen for those with that background is that you need to go into maintenance mode on one thing in pursuit of another for a small period of time. It's dialing one dial down to turn the other one up. And then slowly but surely you can turn on the other dial up, turn the other dial up, I'll enunciate myself more there, and then find that equilibrium and minimum effective dose for the individual. If somebody came to us that's just getting into training, they've sort of been arbitrarily lifting and arbitrarily running as they go, it's a very different consideration, because the example of James is he came with muscle mass, real big strength base, which means there's a lot of work that we can hold on to with a minimum amount of volume, 8 sets a week per body part, for example, to create the room to build the aerobic base, which has now allowed you to run multiple ultras still be mad jacked, still be mad strong, etc., etc. But we've only got there through looking at you as an individual from the start. If somebody came to us that was a relative beginner in both, can you progress in both concurrently? Yes. Are the considerations exactly the same? No, I don't think they are, because as you've already mentioned, the tendons, the demand, the volume here, the volume there is going to be a different set of considerations, which probably means a bit more individual focus in terms of what they respond well to, what they don't respond well to. I know there's certain movements that I do from a hypertrophy point of view that will just blow up my legs. I know there's certain movements that I can do for weeks and weeks and weeks, every single day, 6 times a day on my upper body, and nothing will grow. It's just, it's kind of the individuality there that's worth bearing in mind. And that's something that you can do as an individual listening, watching, or through the expertise of a coach who can keep a closer eye on how you're developing over time. But I want to make crystal clear that I was at an advantage with my hybrid training coming from a strength background. James was at an advantage coming from a strength and bodybuilding background. Somebody listening that wants to squat 140 and go sub 10 in Ironman will be at an advantage if they come from being able to do a sub 9 Ironman already, etc., etc. There is no one way to skin this proverbial cat. And
everybody's going to have some kind of physical bias, aren't they? But if, as you say, if somebody's coming from a very fresh perspective on both, there's actually room for. What's interesting about the James scenario versus that one is that we were able to talk with James and kind of, there might have been a psychological attachment to certain ways of training.
That's a big thing in the exactly. Big thing there, isn't it?
And there might have been I guess a psychological attachment to specific exercises, which we may or may not have. And actually, you came with injury as well, didn't you, James? So we had to kind of play around that a little bit. Somebody new. We don't have those favorites, if you like, already. So we kind of play with certain things, but then we get to work with them directly. And if somebody's doing this on their own, they have to experiment a little bit in a physical way with the different exercises that they've got, because you and I could be doing the same exercise, and as you've just said, you'd be getting much more from one than I'm getting, just because of the length of my, femur or humerus or whatever. It might be something.
It would have been really cool if we did have the same bone there, wouldn't it?
It would have been humorous.
Yeah.
So so there's all these different personal things, and the bodybuilding speaks to that in a very direct way as well. Because obviously, if we want muscles to grow, we need to know whether or not you have the right angle and the right anthropometry. Good God, that didn't come out well.
I think for the sake of rounding this up so people have some clear takeaways, let's do 2 each and go around the houses and give a clear consideration for somebody who wants to build their running capacity and focus on hypertrophy. So I'll kick things off in that if you are coming from a hypertrophy / bodybuilding background, you will typically have a higher body mass and higher body weight, which means that you will not be able to tolerate the same amount of volume that running thread X online says that you need to be able to develop to a 5K. So bear in mind that your tendons, your general structures are going to take a bit more of a beating from the impact. You might not be as skillful with your running from the off, for example. So you need to be quite cautious and steady and listen to how your body is responding to things as you go. Being a heavier body mass isn't a limiting factor. It's just something to bear in mind. So please do, when planning out your programming, if you're doing it yourself rather than using us, is to bear in mind that your volume is not going to be directly translatable to somebody that's just running and building their volume there. So please bear that in mind. Jonny.
Yeah, I think I'd like to touch back upon the psychological element. I think that even when somebody's coming to something like bodybuilding fresh, they'll still have ideas and still have a kind of a viewpoint on it that might be, for want of a better word, myopic, based on what they see in a bodybuilding environment. And I think that we would have to temper that enthusiasm with the understanding that, as you said, volume needs to be controlled on that, and we're trying to do 2 things at once. So we need to kind of make sure that that's understood, and I think that's key, is just understanding the platform that you're trying to grow from, as opposed to thinking, well, it's bodybuilding and running, or the other way around, is running and bodybuilding. It's both, so therefore both have to be kind of considered across the spectrum, if you like.
James?
I would say if you're training in this concurrent fashion, and we've already touched upon having to maybe reduce your weight training volume, making sure that those sets that you are doing are of good quality. Because if you're going from, 15 sets per body part per week down to, let's call it 8, roughly 50%, you want to make sure those sets count, right? You've got much more limited chance to actually make them do what they're meant to be doing. So training close to failure, if not to failure, if it's appropriate. I think that's a big one. And I think, as a slight aside, people who do often do these higher volumes, if they really take a good hard look at it, they're honestly quite often not actually doing all of those sets with very good quality anyway. A lot of them might actually be training to 5 to 6 RPE, for example, when really you want to be pushing most of the time towards a 7 to 10 kind of end of things. Yeah, I think that's a key part of it.
Just worth adding, this might be an odd way to put things, but it's worth considering, is that bodybuilding in of itself is an inefficient way to use muscles. By which I mean,
this is a rabbit hole.
Yeah, to a degree, but I'll make the point quite quickly and clearly, is that if you're doing something, let's look at leg extensions, and we want you to consider tempo. We're not rushing at it. We're not trying to ping the whole bar up and all the rest of it. We're trying to work the full length, the full range of motion of the muscle. It's normal your body wants to find efficiency. Okay, so if you're doing these exercises and being slow and careful for the full range of motion, it's actually inefficient. It's not the fastest way to move it, is it? So we have to learn to do that. As James says, there's skill involved, a lot of skill involved in bodybuilding that people don't seem to recognize quite a lot. But then if you flip that on its head and look at the running, we want you to be as efficient as possible. So you're actually learning two different ways of addressing the skill that your body is trying to learn across two different mediums or two different areas. So I think it's worth remembering, really touching on what James said there, that it's all skill driven and it's all based on what it is that you're looking to get from it. But recognizing that they're different skills means that you've got to recognize in amongst that you're learning new things, and therefore there's got to be space within that program for your body to catch up and for you to take the time to do that.
So train with intent based on the intended stimulus and demand of each session, essentially.
Yeah, exactly that, yeah.
Cool. Nutrition. In terms of bodybuilding understanding, I think bodybuilding in the modern world has the best understanding of performance nutrition out of any corner of the industry. I think there are some endurance cohorts that are still quite a long way behind understanding energy balance, and rather than just thinking, oh, some foods are bad, some foods are good, you should eat this, you should eat that, or I'm going to try keto because this person said it, etc., etc. Bodybuilders have a fantastic understanding of energy balance and nutrition, which is something that's a huge advantage. However, understanding the impact of endurance volume on top of your daily BMR, etc., is something that requires a bit of a restock on how you normally view things, because again, like you've said, bodybuilding can become quite myopic if you're doing it for a long time, for want of a better phrase. But you might believe that my maintenance is 3,000 calories, and therefore you might make the mistake of adding in 3 runs a week and staying at your maintenance of 3,000 calories, whereas you might inadvertently end up putting yourself into quite a sizable deficit, because each time you're running at a higher body mass, as I've already indicated, you're burning a decent amount of calories. So a 5K at an easy pace at 90 kilos would burn about 300 to 400 calories. If you're doing that 3 days a week, even if it's an easy pace, doesn't feel like hard work, you're 1,200 calories out at the end of the week within the context of 7 days. So just be diligent in understanding your outputs and readdressing the bottom line. No tracker is perfect. There's always people commenting, well, no, I don't track what I eat and work from it in calories because it's inaccurate. It's more accurate than you guessing, isn't it? So Strava have a bigger budget for R&D than you do, Kevin. But the bottom line is we recommend eating by, there was, I don't know, maybe there's a guy called Kevin that's actually commented this.
He's ripped, he's looking at you now going, what are you talking about? Tracked everything.
Yeah, so my recommendation that I've always loved from YouTube, because it purely came logically to me, is eat back 90% of the calories that your Garmin, Sunto, Corox, Strava, Apple Watch suggest you've burnt. And then that way, if it's overestimating, you're not eating the entire amount. If it's underestimating, then okay, you may be a couple 100 calories out, but that little galaxy ripple that was sitting on the side of the sort of to the right of the fridge that you just grabbed and didn't put in MyFitnessPal, that'll bring you back to balance anyway. So just essentially restock, recalibrate based on your outputs, because it's easy to get stuck in your way of thinking this is the way that I am, and therefore adding endurance volume might change that. So you've got to readdress the balance.
Johnny. Just to, oh, sorry, no, go on. Johnny,
no, James.
I was just going to say, in addition to that, you mentioned about maintenance. I think unless people sit on the extreme ends of the spectrum of being incredibly lean or light body weight versus like having a high level of body fat or being very overweight, think the majority of people can do well just trying to aim for maintenance the whole time anyway. I think, you know, how we can observe very measurable, quite relatively quick increases in fitness, strength. When it comes to stuff like hypertrophy, it's so slow, almost so slow. It's difficult to actually quantify over like a meaningful period of time. So I think the best policy for most folks is to try and actually just keep their calorie intake at maintenance. We know that even if we're in a deficit, we can still build muscle mass, but being at maintenance calories is actually a really, really good spot to sit and let things happen slowly. Make sure that you're well fueled, make sure you're under fueling, make sure you're not over fueling, and you'll be in a pretty good spot, I'd say.
Yeah, it's an interesting one there, and again another rabbit hole. But I'd underline that for all hybrid training. Really, it's the best place to be, isn't it? Is maintenance or just almost in a tiny surplus, just
2.5% is
something
what
like that. Just something that's going to allow to drive that performance forward and allow for kind of errors and judgment and, you know, overdoing things or whatever. But it's a great point to make. I think
people think.
Go on, mate.
So no, I was just going to say, I think people see maintenance as a bit of a dirty word. I think it's negative, but actually it's really not. It is 100% where the sweet spot is for most people. Again, we talked about, I think we mentioned about that kind of pendulum swing earlier. Somewhere middle of the road is normally the best place to be. Yeah, you know, it's boring as fuck. Well, it's never sexy, it seems boring. It's not sexy, but
yeah. Moderation is key, and I think it's probably worth underlining that this isn't particularly hybrid this or hybrid that, but I think with bodybuilding, correct me if I'm wrong here, James, I think we've said that a few times, but from your perspective, I know you'll agree, it's easy to find yourself in a place where you become very, very engrossed in it and very deeply involved in it, especially because you're managing the minutiae in terms of the diet and all the rest of it. And
which can be very valuable. I think it's worth mentioning.
Oh, yeah. It's absolutely. But I think probably this is where we kind of cross over into the other conversations that we like to have, is that, you know, making sure you're part of a group of people that are involved in this, because it can be quite a lonely experience, can't it? Bodybuilding. Making sure that you're talking to people, the mood stuff that you mentioned earlier on, making sure that that's something that you're talking to people about, that people can kind of check in and go, James, you're in a bit of a funny way at the moment. Is everything okay? You know, you can go, actually, do you know, I've been in a deficit for too long. Let's have a little bit of a break here and make sure that the eating habits that you might adopt during this don't then kind of eat too heavily into your social environment, which again, we touched on a little point in the previous podcasts, and have fun with it. I think of all things, it's not fair to say this in the way that it's going to sound, but bodybuilding, people can take it a little bit too seriously. I think it can become something that people get so involved and so deeply involved in. They forget to just have.
It's so lifestyle dominant.
That's exactly it. That's a better way of putting it. And you know, remember there are other things there. It's a great sport. It's a great thing to do, and it's a great.
The discipline it can instill is.
I think it's fantastic. I genuinely think it's not something I've done, but I love to watch on. But it's also something that you can see people kind of struggle a little bit with. So always get that, you know, group of people around you and make sure you're part of something bigger. I think
you're not getting another point, as you just made one. Community.
That was my point.
Community and support networks, as with all training, but I think the psychological risk for going into a bit of a binary existence is higher with bodybuilding from a psychological point of view, and there's potentially more attachment to certain ways of doing things because it's probably the most well-established resource on the internet, which means that there's a lot of information, and for people that have been in the fitness space for a long time, they might feel quite engrossed in the information that's out there. So a point well made, Jonny. Thank you very much. James, finish us off.
Shall we talk about what we mentioned? So we spoke about body sets per body part, didn't we? This is actually, I think this is a massive one. So when we are looking at training as a whole, even if you don't call yourself hybrid, it is a good shout to have some of these hybrid principles put into place. So we know that we need to be getting in 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity cardio, for example, to making sure not just that you are able to perform, but also that you're just generally physically healthy and fit as well. And I think that needs to be addressed in a lot of people as well. I know I've kind of put myself into this position before where I'll train 5-6 times a week in the gym, but do absolutely zero cardio at all. But more to the point, you try and fool yourself, protect your ego in saying like, oh yeah, my heart rate gets really high during a set of squats, I'm fine. Like you feel like, oh yeah, that's that box ticked, but it's complete bullshit. It's not at all true. So I think that's a that's a big part of it as well. Is just making sure that you are, even if someone's not running, you're getting them to do, you know, some of their aerobic work on the bike to contribute towards their running fitness or just their fitness as a whole, or whatever else it might be.
Recovery capacity, sleep quality, tolerance for food, nutrition partitioning. There's only benefits.
Yeah, makes a huge difference.
Well. Yeah, but I think the key one there is as James says, just being healthy, living longer. And you mentioned walking up the stairs earlier on. You know, you want to be able to. I've said this before, and everybody worries about what I'm doing with my kids. You want to be able to throw them about a bit. You know, if you get tired after wrestling with the 6-year-old for 5 minutes, then there's something wrong with you.
Did you get that window fixed at the house, by the way?
Well, it's his fault. He's the one that went through it, so he can fix it.
Yeah, but who threw him, Johnny? Who threw him? It was his birthday.
This is not hybrid. This is just...
Well, that's what he screamed as he went out the window.
Hybrid!
I did have a point there before we spoke about throwing 6-year-olds out the window.
I think we were kind of summarising the.
We were. Oh yes. Thomas Moore as well. Something that's definitely worth mentioning. TM Cycles, previously, now Thomas Moore on YouTube. He's spoken as well about how much he regrets not doing more cardiovascular work whilst he was really deep in bodybuilding because of the PEDs he was on and the demand that they were having on him. So his long-term health and the consideration and diligent approach he was taking to those, he felt he missed a couple of tricks in terms of the aerobic capacity on top of that maybe would have stacked a few more health benefits on top of a well-controlled top-end experienced bodybuilding setup, because it is a part of the sport at the top end. And I think looking after your health when things like that are to be considered as well is something that's really worth hammering home. And I think we'd be he is a fantastic resource example for anyone, by the way, on anything bodybuilding focused, on a different pathway now in terms of understanding the psychological side of things from his perspective. But
check out Thomas Moore.
Hopefully we'll get him on here at some point. Actually,
yeah, that'd be good. Up for it. He's one of many at the moment. I think we're seeing some big names now having kind of gone through their bodybuilding careers and coming out the other end saying exactly that. I wish I'd looked after, and kind of backtracking, trying to add some aerobic health. Now.
He's swimming and everything again now, isn't it? He's just enjoying
not just
performance goals.
Like I say, there's quite a few, and it's a great knock-on effect of this kind of hybrid environment that we've helped to create. Really, is that people are now kind of a little bit more hyper aware, and arguably, we'll get Thomas on and speak to him about it, but arguably, had he added that aerobic capacity in at the time, not just stacking that on top, he might have been able to stack on more muscle because of the opportunity for peripheral delivery, et cetera, all that stuff that we've talked about before. So chances are that there's an argument there to say that the aerobic capacity that you're talking about, even on a maintenance basis, even on a lifestyle basis, will add the opportunity to build muscle in many ways. So if you can think of a good reason why not to put an aerobic buffer into your bodybuilding, then come back to us and we'll tell you you're wrong.
Yeah, you know where to find us. James, you had something to say before we wrapped up, didn't you?
I was just going to say, even at those extremes of bodybuilding, so, you got right to the levels of Mr. Olympia, even those guys are doing cardio. Granted, they're not going out running 5Ks or whatever, but aerobic work is always going to be in their programs. And I think, in fact, going back onto the PED usage point, the original Bible of the hybrid athlete, written by Alex Viada, I'm pretty sure there is a whole chapter on it talking about cardio for like assisted athletes.
Yep.
So that's a pretty good resource as well. But yeah, like basically the crux of that chapter is those people who are using PEDs have got even more of a reason than anyone else to be doing their aerobic work of a moderate intensity. So
yeah. So to summarize from our perspective, to be brutally honest, bodybuilding / hypertrophy training alongside performance focused cardiovascular modalities is what I'll hold my hand up and say is the hardest thing to balance from a hybrid point of view.
I think so, but it's also the one that I think makes the most. It makes the most sense to pair.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
So let's
just be considerate of it.
And when we're saying that, let's not over egg that pudding. When we're saying that it's the hardest to balance, it's just the one that has the most considerations. It doesn't mean like, oh God, that's going to be too tough. Maybe I'll just do something else. It's just we are thinking about it from a coaching perspective. It's fun to do because there's a lot of variables to play with. But like anything, it comes down to the individual, comes down to communication, it comes down to that minimal dose, taking your time, getting it right, and as we've said, having fun with it and looking after yourself. I think that's probably key to end on.
That's it. That's why we all train the way that we do, is because we enjoy it. We've all gone through our share of binary lifestyle focused existences, and I think we've come out the other side not regretting it, but having instilled the discipline that it gave us. We all learned through our own mechanisms and the sort of experiences that there was more to this for us. And we now train the way that we do because we enjoy it. And I think that's why everybody listening, everybody watching, that's how they should train ultimately. So
agreed.
thank you, everyone. And goodbye.
Goodbye. Yeah.